The alarm pierced the morning calm at Fort Harrison like a blade through silence. Every soldier on the base knew that sound: incoming hostile fire. Within seconds, combat boots thundered across asphalt as troops sprinted toward their assigned positions. But in the chaos, nobody noticed the small figure in fatigues who moved differently than the rest. While others ran with trained urgency, she moved with something else entirely. Something that would soon turn everything Colonel Davidson thought he knew about warfare completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Elena Rodriguez had been invisible for exactly 143 days. Not literally invisible, of course, though sometimes she wondered if that might have been easier. No, Maria was invisible in the way that certain people become when others decide they don't matter. She was invisible in the way that happens when someone looks at you and sees only what they expect to see, never what's actually there. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds soaking wet, Maria cut an unremarkable figure among the towering soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division. Her uniform hung loose on her slight frame, regulation-issued gear that seemed designed for someone twice her size. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun that revealed a face that could have belonged to someone's younger sister rather than a soldier. When she walked through the corridors of Fort Harrison, conversations didn't stop. Heads didn't turn. She was part of the background, as unnoticed as the beige paint on the walls or the fluorescent lights humming overhead. This suited Maria just fine most of the time. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was often more valuable than being respected. People said things around her that they would never say to someone they considered important. They made assumptions that revealed more about themselves than they could possibly imagine. And in the military, where hierarchy and perception shaped reality more than actual capability ever could, invisibility provided a kind of freedom that Maria had learned to treasure. Colonel Thomas Davidson embodied everything Maria despised about military leadership. He was a man who had earned his rank through political maneuvering rather than battlefield excellence, someone who confused volume with authority and mistakes intimidation for leadership. At 52 years old, Davidson carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never questioned his own importance. His uniform was always immaculate, his posture always perfect, and his opinions always delivered with the certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong because he surrounded himself with people too afraid to contradict him. Davidson had made his feelings about women in combat roles abundantly clear from the moment Maria arrived at Fort Harrison. During her first week, she had witnessed him holding court in the officers' mess, regaling his sycophantic audience with theories about female soldiers that belonged in a different century. Biology is destiny, he had proclaimed while cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. You can't change millions of years of evolution with sensitivity training and political correctness. Women simply don't have the physical strength, the mental toughness, or the killer instinct necessary for real combat. The other officers had nodded along like puppets, their agreement as predictable as sunrise. Major Collins, Davidson's second-in-command, had added his own contribution to the discussion. "It's not that we don't value their contributions," he had said in the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "Supply, communications, medical support, these are vital roles. But when bullets start flying, when it comes down to life and death, you need someone you can count on. Someone who won't freeze up when things get ugly." Maria had been restocking the coffee station during this particular performance, her presence so thoroughly dismissed that the officers spoke as if she weren't there at all. She had listened to every word while maintaining the vacant expression that had become her default setting, filing away their assumptions for future reference. They saw her slight build and immediately concluded weakness. They heard her quiet voice and assumed timidity. They watched her defer to authority and mistook submission for inability. What they couldn't see was the steel beneath the surface. What they couldn't know was that Maria Elena Rodriguez had been preparing for war since she was 12 years old. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where survival required skills that no military academy could teach. Her father, Miguel Rodriguez, had been a gang member who found redemption in the army, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home with stories that painted warfare as both horror and honor. Her mother, Carmen, had worked double shifts as a nurse while raising 4 children, demonstrating a different kind of strength that Maria came to understand was no less valuable than anything displayed on any battlefield. The Rodriguez household had been a laboratory for resilience. With Miguel frequently deployed and Carmen working around the clock, Maria had learned to take care of herself and her younger siblings from an early age. She had learned to change diapers and cook meals, to help with homework and mediate fights, to stretch food stamps through the month, and to recognize the difference between neighborhood disputes and genuine threats. By the time she was 14, Maria could field strip an M16 blindfolded, thanks to her father's insistence that all his children understand weapon safety. By 16, she could run 5 miles without breaking a sweat and could bench press her own body weight. But it was the less visible skills that would prove most valuable. Maria had learned to read people the way her father read terrain, identifying threats and opportunities through micro-expressions and body language that others missed entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had developed patience that bordered on supernatural, the ability to wait hours for the right moment to act. Most importantly, she had learned to control her emotions under pressure, to think clearly when others panicked, to make life and death decisions with the calm calculation of someone who understood that survival often depended on being underestimated. When Maria enlisted at 18, she had no illusions about the challenges she would face. The military was still largely a man's world, despite decades of progress toward integration. Women in combat roles faced scrutiny that their male counterparts, never experienced, held to standards that often seemed designed to ensure failure rather than measure capability. But Maria had advantages that her critics couldn't see. She had been fighting for survival her entire life, just not in ways that military evaluations could measure. Basic training had been a revelation in the art of managed expectations. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, Maria found herself operating at perhaps 60% of her actual capability, careful not to stand out too dramatically while still meeting minimum standards. She watched drill sergeants break down recruits who came in cocky, who announced their superiority with every stride. She observed how the most successful soldiers were those who could perform under pressure, without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. The psychological aspects of military training interested her more than the physical challenges. She studied how groups formed hierarchies, how leadership emerged from chaos, how individuals responded to stress and uncertainty. Maria learned to identify the soldiers who would buckle under pressure before they knew it themselves. She recognized the ones who would risk everything to save a teammate and the ones who would sacrifice others to save themselves. This knowledge became her most valuable weapon, though it was one she kept carefully concealed. Advanced infantry training had provided new opportunities to refine her approach. While her male counterparts competed for recognition and advancement, Maria focused on competence and reliability. She completed every assignment to standard, never exceeding expectations dramatically enough to attract attention, but never falling short enough to invite criticism. Her instructors noted her consistency in their evaluations, describing her as a solid performer who could be counted on to complete assigned tasks without drama or complications. What they missed was the level of calculation behind her performance. Maria had studied the evaluation criteria exhaustively, understanding exactly what behaviors were being measured, and how to optimize her scores without revealing her true capabilities. She had learned to miss just enough targets to avoid suspicion, while still qualifying as proficient. She had discovered how to complete obstacle courses at times that suggested good fitness without indicating exceptional athleticism. Most importantly, she had mastered the art of asking questions that made her seem engaged and teachable without revealing the depth of her existing knowledge. The assignment to Fort Harrison had come with mixed emotions. On one hand, the 82nd Airborne Division represented the elite of the Army's rapid deployment forces, units that were expected to be first into combat zones around the world. Assignment to such a prestigious unit suggested that someone, somewhere, had recognized her potential. On the other hand, Fort Harrison was Colonel Davidson's domain, and his reputation for hostility toward female soldiers preceded him like a toxic cloud. Maria's first meeting with Davidson had established the dynamic that would define their relationship for months to come. She had been assigned to Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, which meant reporting directly to Major Collins, but ultimately answering to Davidson's overall command. The colonel had looked her up and down during the brief introduction, his expression suggesting he was evaluating livestock rather than a fellow soldier. Rodriguez, he had said, consulting her file with theatrical deliberation. Los Angeles. Single mother household. Community college dropout. Each fact had been delivered like an accusation, as if her background somehow disqualified her from military service. Tell me, soldier, what makes you think you belong in an elite unit like the 82nd Airborne? The question had been a trap, of course. Answer too confidently, and she would be labeled arrogant. Answer too meekly, and she would confirm his existing assumptions about her inadequacy. Maria had chosen a middle path, expressing gratitude for the opportunity while acknowledging the challenges ahead. Her response had been perfectly calibrated to avoid offense while revealing nothing of substance. "I'm here to serve, sir," she had said, maintaining eye contact without appearing confrontational. "I understand that I need to prove myself, and I'm prepared to work as hard as necessary to meet the standards of this unit." Davidson had nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose prejudices had been confirmed. Here was another young woman who would wash out during the first serious training exercise. Another example of how political correctness was undermining military readiness. He had dismissed her with instructions to report to Sergeant Martinez for assignment to her squad, already mentally composing the evaluation that would recommend her transfer to a more suitable role. Sergeant Carlos Martinez represented a different challenge entirely. Unlike Davidson, who wore his biases like badges of honor, Martinez was a professional soldier who judged people based on performance rather than demographics. He had served multiple combat deployments and had earned his rank through competence rather than politics. Martinez was the kind of leader who could turn average soldiers into exceptional ones, but only if they were willing to accept his guidance and meet his standards. Maria's first conversation with Martinez had revealed a man who was cautiously optimistic about her potential, but realistic about the obstacles she would face. "I'm not going to lie to you, Rodriguez," he had said while reviewing her assignment paperwork. "You're going to have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition that comes automatically to your male counterparts. That's not fair, but it's reality. The question is whether you're prepared to deal with that reality, or whether you're going to spend your time complaining about it." The honesty had been refreshing after Davidson's theatrical hostility. Martinez was offering her a chance to prove herself, but he was also warning her about the standards she would need to meet. Maria had appreciated both the opportunity and the honesty, recognizing in Martinez the kind of leader she could respect even when she disagreed with his methods. Her squad assignment had introduced her to the soldiers she would be working with for the foreseeable future. Bravo Company's 3rd Squad was a collection of personalities that reflected the diversity of the modern military while maintaining the traditional dynamics that had shaped military units for generations. Private Johnson was a former college football player from Alabama whose physical presence dominated any room he entered. Corporal Williams had grown up in Detroit and possessed a street-smart intelligence that complemented his natural leadership abilities. Private First Class Thompson came from a military family and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this life since childhood. The squad's dynamic had been established long before Maria's arrival, with each member occupying a specific role in the informal hierarchy that governed their daily interactions. Johnson was the muscle, the soldier everyone turned to when brute force was required. Williams was the strategist, the one who could see 3 moves ahead in any situation. Thompson was the perfectionist, the soldier who ensured that equipment was maintained and procedures were followed to the letter. Maria's arrival had disrupted this balance in ways that none of them had anticipated. Her slight build and quiet demeanor had initially led them to assume she would be a liability, someone they would need to protect rather than rely upon. But as weeks turned into months, subtle observations began to challenge their assumptions. Maria never complained during long marches, even when they could see exhaustion in her face. She never failed to complete assigned tasks, even when those tasks seemed designed to test her limits. Most importantly, she never asked for special treatment or accommodation, despite the obvious physical disadvantages she faced. The first hint of her true capabilities had come during a routine equipment maintenance session. The squad had been cleaning their weapons after a training exercise when Private Johnson had struggled with a malfunctioning rifle mechanism. The weapon had jammed during live-fire exercises, and Johnson's increasingly frustrated attempts to clear the malfunction were only making the problem worse. Maria had watched his struggle for several minutes before quietly offering assistance. "Mind if I take a look?" she had asked in the same tone someone might use to offer help with a crossword puzzle. Johnson had stepped aside with obvious skepticism, clearly expecting her delicate hands to be even less effective than his own efforts. What happened next had challenged every assumption he had made about her capabilities. Maria's hands had moved over the weapon with surgical precision, her fingers finding problems that Johnson hadn't even recognized existed. She had field-stripped the rifle with movements so economical and efficient that they seemed choreographed, identifying multiple issues that were contributing to the malfunction. Within 3 minutes, she had reassembled the weapon and conducted a function check that confirmed everything was operating perfectly. "How did you know how to do that?" Johnson had asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and confusion. The malfunction Maria had corrected was not covered in standard military training, requiring knowledge that typically came only through extensive experience with firearms. Maria had shrugged off the question with practiced nonchalance. "My dad was big on weapons maintenance," she had said, as if that explanation covered the level of expertise she had just demonstrated. "He always said that your weapon is your life, so you better know how to take care of it." The incident had been dismissed as beginner's luck by most of the squad, but Sergeant Martinez had taken note. He had begun watching Maria more carefully. During subsequent training exercises, looking for patterns that might explain what he had witnessed. What he discovered was a soldier who consistently performed better than her evaluation suggested, someone who seemed to be operating below her actual capability for reasons he couldn't quite understand. Training exercises at Fort Harrison were designed to push soldiers beyond their comfort zones, to identify weaknesses that could be addressed before deployment to active combat zones. The scenarios were realistic, incorporating live ammunition and simulated casualties to create stress levels that approximated actual battlefield conditions. For most soldiers, these exercises were opportunities to demonstrate their readiness for combat. For Maria, they were carefully managed performances designed to meet expectations without revealing too much. During urban warfare simulations, Maria had demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict enemy movements and identify optimal firing positions. But she had been careful to make these insights seem like lucky guesses rather than tactical expertise. When clearing buildings, she had shown remarkable skill at moving silently through confined spaces and identifying potential threats. She had attributed these abilities to her small size, rather than specialized training she had never officially received. The most challenging aspect of maintaining her cover was dealing with Davidson's increasingly targeted harassment. The colonel had made Maria a special project, assigning her to details that were designed to highlight her supposed inadequacies. He had volunteered her for additional duties that would stretch her physical and mental limits, always in front of audiences that could witness her struggles. His comments during training exercises had become increasingly personal, attacking not just her performance, but her right to wear the uniform at all. "Rodriguez," he had announced during one particularly memorable formation, "I want you to demonstrate proper rifle maintenance for the new recruits." The assignment had been presented as an honor, but Maria had recognized it as another trap. Davidson was expecting her to fail publicly, providing him with ammunition for his ongoing campaign to remove women from combat roles. Instead, Maria had delivered a flawless demonstration that had impressed both the recruits and their instructors. Her explanation of weapon systems had been clear and comprehensive. Her handling of the equipment had been professional and confident. When she had finished, even Davidson had been forced to acknowledge that her performance had met standard, though he had done so with obvious reluctance. These small victories had begun to accumulate, creating a reputation that complicated Maria's efforts to remain invisible. Other soldiers had started seeking her assistance with technical problems, recognizing her expertise even if they couldn't explain where it had come from. Squad leaders had begun requesting her for assignments that required attention to detail and technical proficiency. Most dangerously, Martinez had started asking questions that suggested he was beginning to see through her carefully constructed facade. The breaking point had come during a field training exercise that was designed to simulate prolonged combat operations. The scenario had placed 3rd Squad in a defensive position for 72 hours, requiring them to maintain vigilance while managing limited resources and dealing with simulated attacks at irregular intervals. By the second day, exhaustion had begun to affect everyone's performance except Maria's. While her squad mates had grown increasingly irritable and unfocused, Maria had remained alert and responsive. She had volunteered for extra watch duty without being asked, had shared her rations with soldiers who had managed their supplies poorly, and had maintained her equipment to standards that exceeded what was expected under field conditions. Most tellingly, she had begun making tactical suggestions that demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that her official training record couldn't explain. During a simulated night attack, Maria had identified weaknesses in their defensive perimeter that neither Martinez nor Williams had recognized. Her recommendations for repositioning personnel and adjusting fields of fire had been so obviously correct that Martinez had implemented them immediately, despite his growing suspicions about her background. The result had been a nearly perfect defensive action that had impressed the evaluating officers and earned commendations for the entire squad. But success had come with consequences. Davidson had been present during the exercise, observing from a position that allowed him to see everything that had happened. Maria's performance had been too exceptional to dismiss, too obviously professional to attribute to luck or beginner's enthusiasm. For the first time since her arrival at Fort Harrison, the colonel had begun to take her seriously as a potential threat to his worldview. The post-exercise debrief had been conducted in a conference room that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a training venue. Davidson had positioned himself at the head of a long table, with Martinez and the squad leaders arranged along the sides like a military tribunal. Maria had been placed at the opposite end, isolated and under scrutiny from every angle. "Soldier Rodriguez," Davidson had begun, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "Your performance during this exercise was unexpected. Your tactical recommendations were particularly sophisticated for someone with your level of training and experience. I'm curious about how you developed such insights." The question had been phrased as professional interest, but Maria had recognized the underlying suspicion. Davidson was looking for evidence that she had received training that wasn't reflected in her official record, or worse, that she was somehow cheating to achieve results that he believed were beyond her capabilities. Her response had to be careful, acknowledging her performance without claiming expertise that would invite further investigation. "Sir, I spend a lot of time studying military history and tactics," she had said, which was technically true even if it didn't come close to explaining the full scope of her background. "I read about defensive strategies used in previous conflicts, and I try to apply those lessons to our training scenarios." Davidson had pressed for specifics, asking about particular sources and methods that had informed her recommendations. Maria had provided answers that were accurate but incomplete, describing books and articles that any motivated soldier might study while carefully avoiding mention of the more specialized knowledge that had actually guided her decisions. The interrogation had continued for nearly an hour, with Davidson probing for inconsistencies that might expose whatever deception he was convinced she was practicing. In the end, he had been forced to accept her explanations, though his expression had made clear that he remained unconvinced. Maria had been dismissed with instructions to report for additional training exercises that would provide more opportunities for evaluation. As she had left the conference room, she had caught Martinez watching her with the kind of intensity that suggested he was beginning to see patterns that others had missed. The weeks following the field exercise had brought new challenges and new opportunities. Davidson's increased attention had made it more difficult for Maria to fly under the radar, but it had also provided chances to demonstrate capabilities that had previously remained hidden. Training scenarios had become more complex and demanding, pushing the entire unit toward levels of performance that would prepare them for actual combat deployment. Maria's response to these increased demands had been carefully calibrated. She had continued to excel without appearing exceptional, meeting higher standards, while making her success seem like the natural result of hard work and determination rather than innate ability or specialized training. The balance had become increasingly difficult to maintain as expectations rose and scrutiny intensified. The squad's dynamic had evolved as well, with Maria gradually earning the respect of soldiers who had initially dismissed her as a liability. Johnson had begun asking for her assistance with equipment problems, recognizing her technical expertise even if he couldn't explain where it had come from. Williams had started including her in tactical discussions, valuing her insights even when they challenged his own assumptions. Thompson had begun treating her as a peer rather than a burden, acknowledging her contributions to the squad's overall effectiveness. But respect had come with new forms of pressure. As Maria's reputation had grown, expectations for her performance had increased accordingly. Soldiers who had once been content to carry her weight now expected her to pull her own load, and then some squad leaders who had once made allowances for her supposed limitations now held her to the same standards they applied to everyone else. The most significant change had been in Sergeant Martinez's attitude toward her development. He had begun assigning her additional responsibilities and advanced training opportunities, preparing her for leadership roles that she had never officially sought. His guidance had been valuable, but it had also forced Maria to reveal more of her capabilities than she was comfortable showing. During a weapons proficiency exercise, Martinez had challenged her to qualify on systems that weren't typically assigned to soldiers at her level. The M240 machine gun required upper body strength that most people assumed Maria lacked, but she had handled the weapon with competence that surprised everyone present. Her accuracy scores had been exceptional, placing her among the top performers in the entire company despite her supposed inexperience with the system. Similar patterns had emerged during hand-to-hand combat training, where Maria's small size had initially been seen as a decisive disadvantage. Instead, she had demonstrated techniques that used leverage and momentum to overcome opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. Her movements had been too precise and economical to be attributed to natural ability alone, suggesting training that her official record couldn't account for. Each demonstration of exceptional capability had raised new questions about Maria's background while simultaneously making it more difficult for Davidson to justify his continued hostility toward her presence in the unit. She was clearly capable of performing at levels that exceeded many of her male counterparts, undermining his arguments about the inherent limitations of female soldiers. But her success had also intensified his determination to find some flaw or weakness that would validate his existing beliefs. The psychological pressure of maintaining her deception while meeting increasingly demanding standards had begun to take its toll. Maria had found herself walking a tightrope between competence and excellence, success and suspicion. Every training exercise had become a performance where she had to calculate not just how to succeed, but how to succeed in ways that wouldn't invite questions she couldn't answer. Late nights in her quarters had been spent reviewing her performance, analyzing every word and gesture for signs that might have revealed too much. She had practiced responses to questions that Martinez and Davidson might ask, preparing explanations that would satisfy their curiosity without exposing the truth about her background. The mental effort required to maintain multiple levels of deception while performing at peak physical and intellectual capacity had been exhausting in ways that combat training couldn't replicate, but there had been compensations as well. Despite the stress and uncertainty, Maria had found herself genuinely enjoying aspects of military life that she hadn't expected to appreciate. The camaraderie of her squad, the satisfaction of mastering new skills, the sense of purpose that came from serving something larger than herself. These had been rewards that no amount of deception could diminish. She had also begun to understand that her presence was having effects beyond her own situation. Other female soldiers had been watching her performance, drawing inspiration from her success, even if they didn't understand how she was achieving it. The barriers that Davidson represented were being challenged not through direct confrontation but through demonstrated competence that made his prejudices increasingly difficult to maintain. As summer had turned to fall, rumors had begun circulating about potential deployment opportunities. The 82nd Airborne's mission as a rapid reaction force meant that units could be called to action anywhere in the world with minimal notice. Training exercises had taken on new urgency as soldiers prepared for the possibility that their skills might soon be tested under actual combat conditions. For Maria, the prospect of deployment had brought both excitement and apprehension. Real combat would provide opportunities to demonstrate her true capabilities without the constraints that training exercises imposed. But it would also mean operating under conditions where mistakes could have consequences far more serious than unfavorable evaluations or additional training assignments. The possibility that she might soon be fighting alongside soldiers who still didn't fully understand her background had forced Maria to confront questions about when and how to reveal the truth about her capabilities. Could she maintain her deception indefinitely, or would combat conditions eventually force her to abandon the careful balance she had maintained for so long? Would her squad mates accept the revelation that she had been operating below her actual capability, or would they feel betrayed by what they might see as deliberate deception? These questions had become more urgent as training exercises had grown more realistic and demanding. Davidson's pressure had continued to intensify, with assignments clearly designed to break her will or expose her limitations. Martinez's guidance had become more focused on combat leadership, preparing her for responsibilities that would require her to reveal capabilities she had spent months concealing. The tension between her official role and her actual abilities had reached a point where resolution seemed inevitable. Something would have to give, whether through deployment to actual combat, discovery of her true background, or a confrontation that would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting her fellow soldiers. As autumn had deepened, and the possibility of deployment had grown more concrete, Maria had found herself spending quiet moments, wondering what her father would think of the situation she had created. Miguel Rodriguez had taught her that honor sometimes required sacrifice, that serving others was worth personal cost. But he had also taught her that deception corroded the soul, that living as someone other than yourself was its own form of surrender. The resolution, when it came, would challenge everything Maria thought she knew about honor, duty, and the price of proving herself worthy of the uniform she wore. The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away all pretense and reveal the truth about who Maria Elena Rodriguez really was. But first, Fort Harrison would face a test that no training exercise could simulate, a crisis that would push every soldier to their limits and beyond. The morning of October 15th had dawned clear and crisp, with temperatures that promised a perfect day for outdoor training exercises. Maria had risen before dawn, as was her habit, using the quiet hours to maintain her equipment and review the day's scheduled activities. 3rd Squad was assigned to participate in a joint training exercise with elements from the base's Special Operations Unit, an opportunity that was considered both an honor and a significant challenge. As she had prepared her gear in the pre-dawn darkness, Maria had felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that preceded any meaningful test of her abilities. The exercise would involve complex scenarios that would push her squad to demonstrate capabilities that went beyond basic infantry tactics. Success would bring recognition and advancement opportunities. Failure would provide Davidson with ammunition for his ongoing campaign against her continued presence in the unit. But as Maria had shouldered her pack and prepared to join her squad mates for morning formation, she had no way of knowing that this would be the day when all of her careful calculations would become irrelevant. The test that awaited her would be far more serious than any training exercise, and the stakes would be measured not in evaluation scores, but in lives saved or lost. The morning formation had proceeded normally, with Sergeant Martinez reviewing the day's objectives while highlighting safety protocols that would govern the training exercise. The scenarios would involve live ammunition and simulated casualties, requiring every participant to maintain strict discipline while demonstrating tactical proficiency under pressure. Maria had listened to the briefing with the focused attention she brought to all professional activities, mentally rehearsing her role while calculating how to perform effectively without attracting unwanted attention. As the sun had risen above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the soldiers of Fort Harrison had prepared to begin what they expected to be another day of routine training. None of them, including Maria, had any reason to suspect that by evening everything would be different. The carefully maintained balance of expectations and capabilities that had defined her existence for months was about to be shattered by events that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The stage was set for a transformation that would reveal Maria Elena Rodriguez as far more than anyone had imagined, but it would also test whether the price of that revelation was worth the cost in lives and relationships that had taken months to build. The invisible soldier was about to become very visible indeed, and the consequences would reshape everything about how Fort Harrison understood the meaning of warrior material. Act 2A, Rising Tension and Hidden Capabilities. The morning started like any other training day, but the atmosphere felt different. There was an electricity in the air that experienced soldiers learned to recognize, the kind of tension that precedes something significant. Maria had noticed it during roll call when Sergeant Martinez's usual briefing carried an edge of urgency that hadn't been there the day before. The joint training exercise with Special Operations was supposed to be routine, but the additional security personnel around the base suggested otherwise. Captain Reynolds from Special Operations had arrived. with his team 3 days earlier, bringing equipment that seemed excessive for a simple training scenario. Their vehicles were loaded with communications gear that belonged in active war zones, and their weapons carried modifications that suggested they expected more than simulated combat. When Maria had glimpsed their mission briefing materials during a supply run, she had noticed maps of the surrounding area marked with defensive positions and evacuation routes that extended far beyond the training zone boundaries. The exercise itself began with textbook precision. 3rd Squad was assigned to work alongside a special operations team in a scenario that simulated defending a forward operating base against coordinated enemy attacks. The training area had been configured to represent a small outpost in hostile territory, complete with defensive barriers, communication equipment, and simulated civilian personnel who would need protection during the engagement. Maria found herself positioned as part of the perimeter security detail, a role that theoretically matched her official capabilities while keeping her away from the more complex tactical operations that would occupy the senior personnel. It was exactly the kind of assignment that Davidson would have chosen for her, something that appeared important while actually minimizing her opportunities to demonstrate advanced skills. But Maria had long ago learned to find advantages in apparent disadvantages, and her position gave her an excellent view of the entire operational area. The first wave of simulated attacks proceeded according to the training script, with opposing forces approaching from predictable directions, using tactics that allowed the defending team to demonstrate their defensive capabilities without facing genuine challenges. Maria played her assigned role perfectly, maintaining her position while engaging targets with the competent but unremarkable accuracy that had become her trademark. Her communications with the command post were professional and efficient, providing exactly the kind of performance that would satisfy evaluators without attracting special attention. But even during these routine phases of the exercise, Maria's trained eyes were picking up details that didn't fit the official scenario. The opposing forces were using movement patterns that suggested real military training rather than the improvised tactics typical of training personnel playing enemy roles. Their equipment was more sophisticated than what was usually employed in exercises, and their coordination indicated a level of preparation that seemed excessive for simulating irregular combatants. More concerning were the subtle changes in conveyan behavior among the permanent base personnel. Security guards who usually maintained relaxed postures during training exercises were displaying alertness levels appropriate for genuine threats. Communication traffic was heavier than normal, with encrypted channels being used for conversations that should have been routine coordination. Most tellingly, the base's early warning systems were operating at full capacity rather than the reduced levels typical during controlled training events. Maria's instincts, honed through years of reading dangerous situations, were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with what was supposed to be a routine exercise. But her official role as a junior enlisted soldier provided no mechanism for expressing these concerns, and her carefully maintained facade prevented her from demonstrating the level of situational awareness that might have given her observations credibility. The breakthrough moment came during the second phase of the exercise, when the scenario called for special operations personnel to conduct a reconnaissance mission beyond the perimeter, while 3rd Squad maintained defensive positions. Captain Reynolds had briefed his team using terminology and procedures that Maria recognized from contexts far more serious than training exercises. Their equipment loadout included items that served no purpose in simulated combat, but would be essential for real operations behind enemy lines. As Reynolds' team prepared to depart, Maria caught fragments of radio communications that confirmed her growing suspicions. References to actual threats and confirmed intelligence suggested that the exercise was providing cover for a genuine operation. The Special Operations Team wasn't just training. They were preparing to respond to a real situation that threatened the security of Fort Harrison and possibly the surrounding civilian population. The realization forced Maria to confront a dilemma that her months of careful deception had been designed to avoid. Her official role as a junior soldier precluded her from taking action based on intelligence she wasn't supposed to possess or understand. But her actual capabilities and experience made her uniquely qualified to recognize and respond to the developing threat. The question was whether she could find a way to contribute without completely abandoning the facade that had protected her for so long. The opportunity came when Private Johnson experienced equipment failure that threatened to compromise his position in the defensive perimeter. His radio had malfunctioned during a routine equipment check, leaving a gap in communications that would normally require repositioning other personnel to maintain coverage. The standard procedure would have been to rotate assignments until replacement equipment could be obtained, but this would have disrupted the defensive formation at a critical moment. Maria volunteered to attempt field repairs on Johnson's radio, knowing that success would require technical knowledge that exceeded her official training level. But the risk of exposure seemed less important than ensuring that the squad maintained operational readiness during what she increasingly suspected was more than a training exercise. Her work on the radio proceeded under the watchful eyes of Sergeant Martinez, who was clearly evaluating her performance for signs of the unusual competence he had begun to suspect. The repair required Maria to access circuit boards and modify component connections using techniques that weren't covered in standard military technical training. Her movements were confident and efficient, suggesting familiarity with electronic systems that should have been beyond her experience level. When she restored the radio to full functionality within 15 minutes, her success was too complete to be attributed to luck or basic knowledge. Martinez's questions about her technical background had become more direct and specific following the radio repair. His inquiries suggested that he was beginning to construct a theory about her true capabilities, though he hadn't yet reached conclusions that would threaten her carefully maintained cover. Maria's responses had walked the familiar line between honesty and misdirection, acknowledging her success while deflecting attention from the skills that had made it possible. But the squad's dynamic had shifted perceptibly following her demonstration of technical expertise. Johnson's gratitude was genuine and openly expressed, marking the first time any of her squadmates had explicitly acknowledged depending on her capabilities. Williams had begun including her in tactical discussions with a seriousness that suggested he was reconsidering his assumptions about her potential contributions. Even Thompson, normally focused exclusively on regulations and procedures, had started asking for her input on equipment maintenance issues. The third phase of the exercise brought new challenges that tested the squad's ability to respond to complex tactical situations under pressure. The scenario called for defending against coordinated attacks while simultaneously conducting evacuation operations for simulated civilian personnel. The complexity required split-second decision-making and seamless coordination between team members who trusted each other completely. Maria's role in this phase was supposed to be limited to providing suppressive fire, while senior personnel managed the tactical aspects of the defense. But the developing situation quickly exceeded the parameters of routine training exercises, requiring responses that drew on capabilities she had spent months concealing. When Williams was temporarily incapacitated by simulated injuries, Maria found herself assuming responsibilities that officially belonged to more senior personnel. Her management of the evacuation procedures revealed planning skills and tactical awareness that couldn't be explained by her official training record. She coordinated movement patterns that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure to enemy fire, demonstrating understanding of terrain analysis and threat assessment that typically required years of advanced education. Her radio communications with other units employed terminology and procedures that suggested familiarity with command structures and operational protocols beyond her stated experience level. The most revealing moment came when Maria identified a potential ambush position that both Martinez and the Special Operations personnel had missed during their initial reconnaissance. Her analysis of enemy movement patterns had led her to recognize that the opposing forces were positioning themselves for attacks that weren't part of the original training scenario. Her warning allowed friendly forces to reposition before walking into what could have been a devastating tactical trap. The accuracy of her tactical prediction forced Martinez to acknowledge that Maria possessed situational awareness capabilities that exceeded those of soldiers with far more experience and training. His direct questions about her background had become impossible to deflect with vague references to studying military history and learning from her father's stories. The level of expertise she was demonstrating required formal training that her official record couldn't account for. Maria's response to Martinez's intensified scrutiny had been to gradually reveal selected aspects of her true background while maintaining the fiction that protected her most sensitive capabilities. She acknowledged having received informal training from family members with military experience, admitting to knowledge that exceeded standard expectations, while stopping short of revealing the full scope of her preparation for military service. This partial honesty had satisfied Martinez's immediate concerns while creating new complications for Maria's long-term strategy. Her sergeant was clearly planning to recommend her for advanced training opportunities and leadership responsibilities. That would place her under increased scrutiny from higher-ranking officers. Success in these roles would require her to demonstrate capabilities that would inevitably attract attention from personnel like Davidson, who were actively looking for reasons to question her qualifications. The fourth phase of the exercise had introduced urban warfare scenarios that tested the squad's ability to operate in environments where civilian and military considerations created complex ethical and tactical challenges. The training area had been configured to simulate a small town where enemy forces were using civilian buildings for cover while conducting attacks against military targets. Rules of engagement required absolute precision to avoid simulated civilian casualties while maintaining effective defensive operations. Maria's performance during urban warfare training had been exceptional in ways that couldn't be concealed or explained by her official background. Her movement through confined spaces demonstrated tactical skills that required specialized training in close-quarters combat. Her ability to identify enemy positions while avoiding civilian areas showed understanding of urban warfare principles that weren't covered in basic infantry training. Most significantly, her coordination with other team members revealed leadership capabilities that suggested natural aptitude enhanced by advanced education. The cumulative effect of these demonstrations had been to establish Maria as one of the most capable soldiers in 3rd Squad, despite her junior rank and limited official experience. Her squad mates had begun deferring to her judgment on tactical matters, recognizing expertise that they couldn't explain, but had learned to trust. Even senior personnel from other units had taken notice of her performance, creating opportunities for advancement that Maria hadn't sought, but couldn't gracefully refuse. The psychological pressure of operating at her actual capability level while maintaining the fiction of gradual improvement had become increasingly difficult to manage. Each successful demonstration of her skills created expectations for continued excellence that made future deception more challenging. The careful balance she had maintained between competence and concealment was shifting toward revelation regardless of her intentions to remain invisible. Late-night conversations with her squad mates had revealed their growing respect for her capabilities, alongside their confusion about her background. Johnson had expressed genuine curiosity about how someone with her official training record had developed such advanced skills. Williams had begun asking questions about her tactical theories that suggested he was trying to understand the intellectual framework behind her decision-making. Thompson had started seeking her advice on leadership challenges, recognizing abilities that weren't reflected in her rank or position. These relationships had become increasingly important to Maria, as her time at Fort Harrison had extended beyond her original expectations. The bonds formed through shared training and mutual dependence were creating emotional connections that complicated her strategic calculations. The squad wasn't just a professional assignment anymore. They were becoming the closest thing to family she had experienced since enlisting. The prospect of continuing to deceive people who trusted her was becoming personally painful in ways she hadn't anticipated. But the alternatives were equally problematic. Complete honesty about her background would require explanations that could compromise operational security and potentially endanger personnel who weren't cleared for certain types of information. Partial truth would create new deceptions that might be even more difficult to maintain than her current strategy. Transfer to another unit would require starting over with new personnel who might be less accepting of her presence and capabilities. The exercise's final phase had brought these tensions to a head through scenarios that required the squad to operate independently while maintaining coordination with special operations personnel who were conducting parallel missions. The complexity demanded trust and communication that couldn't be sustained while maintaining fundamental deceptions about capabilities and background. Maria found herself forced to choose between operational effectiveness and personal security. Her decision to prioritize mission success over personal concealment had marked a turning point in her approach to managing her dual identity. Instead of calculating how to succeed without attracting attention, she began focusing on achieving objectives regardless of the scrutiny that excellence might bring. The change was subtle but significant, representing a shift from defensive to assertive strategies for managing her situation. The immediate results had been impressive tactical successes that earned recognition from evaluating officers and special operations personnel alike. Maria's contributions to mission planning and execution had been acknowledged in ways that made further attempts at invisibility impossible. Her expertise was becoming an official asset rather than a carefully guarded secret, creating new opportunities while eliminating familiar protections. But success had also attracted Davidson's renewed attention at a time when his hostility toward female soldiers was reaching new levels of intensity. Recent policy changes mandating increased integration of women into combat roles had triggered a campaign of resistance that made Maria a symbolic target for larger political battles. Her exceptional performance was being interpreted as a challenge to his authority and worldview that required decisive response. The colonel's strategy for dealing with Maria's growing reputation had evolved from casual dismissal to active sabotage. Training assignments were being structured to highlight areas where her slight physical build might create disadvantages, while administrative decisions were being made to limit her access to advanced training opportunities that would normally follow from her demonstrated performance level. Most dangerously, Davidson was beginning to ask questions about her background that suggested he was conducting his own investigation into her qualifications and training history. These developments had forced Maria to accelerate her timeline for deciding how much of her true background to reveal and when to make those revelations. The gradual approach that had served her well during the early months of her assignment was becoming unsustainable as external pressures created demands for immediate clarity about her capabilities and intentions. The careful balance between truth and deception that had protected her was collapsing under the weight of success that could no longer be concealed or explained through conventional narratives. The morning of the 5th day of training exercises had brought news that transformed the entire situation from controlled preparation to actual emergency response. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces had infiltrated the area surrounding Fort Harrison with intentions that posed genuine threats to base security and civilian populations. The training exercise was being converted to operational status, requiring all participating personnel to transition from simulated combat to actual defense of critical installations. Maria's response to this announcement had revealed the depth of her preparation for exactly this type of situation. While other soldiers had required time to adjust their mindset from training to operational status, she had immediately begun implementing security protocols and threat assessment procedures that suggested extensive experience with real-world combat operations. Her transition had been so seamless that it attracted notice from personnel who were struggling to make the same psychological adjustment. The transformation from exercise participant to operational defender had eliminated many of the constraints that had governed Maria's behavior during the preceding months. Official regulations regarding training safety and evaluation procedures no longer applied, replaced by combat protocols that prioritized effectiveness over conventional military hierarchy. The change created opportunities for Maria to demonstrate capabilities that had been suppressed by training limitations, while simultaneously increasing the stakes for any decisions about revealing her true background. Sergeant Martinez's briefing on the transition to operational status had included assignments that reflected his evolving understanding of Maria's capabilities. Instead of limiting her to basic security functions, he had designated her as part of the reconnaissance team responsible for gathering intelligence about enemy positions and intentions. The assignment represented a significant increase in responsibility and trust, but it also placed her in situations where her advanced skills would be essential for mission success and personal survival. The squad's preparation for actual combat operations had revealed the extent to which their dynamics had changed during the extended training period. Maria was no longer being protected or accommodated by her teammates. She was being counted on to contribute at levels that matched her demonstrated abilities, regardless of her official rank or experience record. The shift represented both validation of her efforts to earn their respect and acceptance of responsibilities that would make future deception impossible. As evening approached and the transition to operational status became complete, Maria found herself facing the reality that her carefully maintained double life was about to end. The combination of external threats and internal pressures had created circumstances where her true capabilities would either be fully revealed or completely suppressed. There was no middle ground available when lives depended on maximum effectiveness from every member of the team. The stage was set for confrontations that would test not just Maria's tactical skills, but her ability to navigate the political and personal consequences of abandoning the deception that had defined her existence. At Fort Harrison, the invisible soldier was about to become the most visible person on the base, and the transformation would challenge everyone's assumptions about capability, identity, and the true meaning of warrior material. The first shots weren't supposed to be real. When the crack of rifle fire echoed across the training ground at 0347 hours, every soldier initially assumed it was part of the exercise's night phase. The distinctive snap of bullets passing overhead was familiar from countless training scenarios, but something about the sound felt wrong to those with enough experience to recognize the difference. The rounds were moving too fast, hitting too hard, and coming from directions that weren't part of any approved training script. Maria knew the difference immediately. Real combat has a signature that no simulation can replicate perfectly: the way bullets actually tear through air, the specific sound they make when striking different materials, the particular quality of muzzle flashes in darkness. Her body responded with reactions that bypassed conscious thought, dropping into defensive positions and analyzing threat vectors with processing speed that came from somewhere far deeper than basic infantry training. Lieutenant Harrison, the officer coordinating the night exercise, was among the first to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. His radio communications with base command became increasingly urgent as reports flooded in from multiple positions around the perimeter. Unknown hostiles had penetrated the outer security zone and were conducting coordinated attacks against key installations. This wasn't a training malfunction or accidental discharge, Fort Harrison. was under genuine assault by forces that had been planning this operation for months. The base's emergency response protocols activated within minutes of the first confirmed hostile contact. Sirens that had been silent since the last major exercise wailed across the installation, their distinctive pattern signaling that all personnel should immediately transition to combat readiness. Floodlights illuminated previously dark areas, transforming the familiar landscape into a stark tableau of defensive positions and potential killing fields. The comfortable routine of military life evaporated as survival instincts took precedence over everything else. Maria's squad found themselves positioned at what intelligence quickly identified as one of the primary infiltration routes. Their training area, chosen for its realistic terrain features, had become an actual battlefield where the tactics they had been practicing would determine whether they lived through the night. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who had time to consider it, but survival calculations left little room for philosophical reflection. Sergeant Martinez's leadership during the transition from exercise to combat revealed why he had earned his rank through battlefield performance rather than administrative advancement. His orders were crisp and decisive, positioning his soldiers to maximize defensive effectiveness while maintaining communication with other units coordinating the base's overall response. But even Martinez, with years of combat experience, was unprepared for what Maria would reveal about herself during the first genuine firefight. The attacking force demonstrated tactical sophistication that suggested military training and detailed intelligence about Fort Harrison's defensive capabilities. Their approach routes avoided known observation points while exploiting blind spots that shouldn't have been apparent to outside observers. Their timing coordinated with shift changes and routine maintenance activities that created temporary vulnerabilities in the base's security posture. Most concerning, their equipment and techniques indicated access to classified information about defensive systems and response protocols. When the first enemy squad attempted to breach 3rd Squad's defensive sector, Maria's response shattered every assumption her teammates had developed about her capabilities during months of careful observation. Her rifle work displayed marksmanship that belonged in elite competitions rather than basic infantry units. Her movement between firing positions demonstrated tactical mobility that suggested advanced training in small unit operations. Most revealing, her communication and coordination with other squad members reflected understanding of combined arms tactics that wasn't covered in any training manual available to soldiers at her supposed experience level. Private Johnson, positioned to Maria's left during the initial engagement, watched her acquire and engage targets with precision that defied everything he thought he knew about her background. Her shots were finding their marks at ranges that challenged even experienced marksmen, and her target selection revealed tactical thinking that prioritized threats according to sophisticated threat assessment criteria. When she called out enemy positions and movement patterns, her information was consistently accurate and tactically relevant in ways that saved lives and maintained defensive integrity. The sustained firefight lasted nearly 40 minutes, with enemy forces probing different aspects of the defensive perimeter, while seeking weaknesses that would allow deeper penetration into the base complex. During this period, Maria's performance evolved from exceptional to unprecedented, displaying capabilities that belonged in special operations units rather than regular infantry assignments. Her situational awareness extended beyond her immediate area of responsibility, providing warning of threats that other defenders hadn't detected and coordinating responses that enhanced the effectiveness of the entire defensive effort. Corporal Williams, who had begun to suspect that Maria possessed unusual tactical knowledge, found his theories confirmed in ways that raised new questions about her true background. Her understanding of enemy tactics allowed her to predict their movements with accuracy that seemed impossible for someone with her official training record. When she recommended repositioning certain defensive elements to counter anticipated flanking maneuvers, her suggestions were so obviously correct that Williams implemented them without question, despite the fact that they contradicted established defensive protocols. The breakthrough moment came when enemy forces attempted to employ a complex diversionary attack, designed to draw defenders away from their primary target. The tactic was sophisticated enough to fool experienced officers, who were focused on immediate threats rather than broader strategic considerations. But Maria recognized the pattern immediately, identifying it as a variation of techniques used by insurgent forces in theaters where American troops had been engaged for years. Her warning about the true nature of the attack allowed base command to maintain defensive focus on critical installations while containing the diversionary element. Colonel Davidson, monitoring the engagement from the command center, initially dismissed reports about Maria's exceptional performance as combat stress affecting the judgment of personnel under fire for the first time. His worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that the soldier he had CONSISTENTL disparaged was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded those of officers with years of advanced training. But as reports continued to arrive from multiple sources, all describing the same phenomena, he was forced to confront evidence that challenged his fundamental assumptions about military capability and gender. The enemy's withdrawal came as suddenly as their initial assault, with hostile forces disengaging across multiple sectors simultaneously in a coordinated movement that suggested central command and control. Their departure left behind evidence of planning and preparation that intelligence analysts would spend weeks studying, but the immediate priority was conducting damage assessment and treating casualties. Fort Harrison had survived its first genuine attack in decades, but the cost had been significant in both human and material terms. Maria's performance during the after-action procedures revealed additional layers of expertise that her squad mates were beginning to recognize as far more than exceptional natural ability. Her knowledge of casualty treatment procedures exceeded basic first aid training, demonstrating familiarity with combat medicine that suggested specialized education. Her ability to assess and repair damaged equipment indicated technical knowledge that belonged in maintenance units rather than infantry assignments. Most significantly, her debriefing contributions provided tactical analysis that helped intelligence personnel understand enemy capabilities and intentions. The medical evaluation that followed any combat engagement brought new complications for Maria's efforts to maintain operational security about her background. Combat stress reactions and adrenaline responses could reveal physical conditioning and psychological preparation that didn't match official training records. Her heart rate and blood pressure readings during and after the engagement suggested adaptation to combat stress that typically required extensive experience under fire. When the medics commented on her unusual physiological responses, Maria had to provide explanations that acknowledged unusual fitness levels while avoiding discussion of how she had achieved them. Sergeant Martinez's post-combat evaluation of his squad's performance included observations about Maria that would require official documentation and reporting to higher headquarters. Her contributions to the defensive success couldn't be ignored or minimized, but acknowledging them fully would raise questions about her qualifications and background that might compromise operational security considerations. His solution was to focus on her tactical contributions while downplaying the level of expertise required to make such contributions effectively. The investigation into how enemy forces had obtained intelligence about Fort Harrison's defensive capabilities soon revealed security breaches that extended far beyond simple reconnaissance. Classified information about patrol schedules, communication frequencies, and defensive positions had been compromised through sources that suggested insider knowledge or sophisticated electronic surveillance. The scope of the intelligence gathering indicated that the attack had been planned for months, with enemy forces conducting detailed preparation that included identifying specific personnel and their capabilities. Maria's name appeared on captured enemy documents in ways that suggested she had been specifically identified as a high-value target. The documents described her as possessing capabilities that far exceeded her official rank and assignment, indicating that hostile intelligence services had developed accurate assessments of her true background despite her efforts to maintain operational security. The revelation forced base security personnel to confront the possibility that Maria's cover had been compromised long before the attack, raising questions about how her true identity had been discovered and what other information might have been leaked. The interrogation of captured enemy personnel provided additional insights into their intelligence about Fort Harrison's defensive capabilities and key personnel. Several prisoners specifically mentioned Maria by name, describing her as a significant threat that required special attention during any assault on the base. Their knowledge of her background included details that weren't contained in any official military records, suggesting access to intelligence sources that operated outside normal channels. The scope of their information indicated that Maria's operational security had been compromised at levels that threatened not just her personal safety, but the security of operations she had been involved with throughout her military career. Colonel Davidson's reaction to learning that enemy forces had specifically targeted Maria revealed the extent to which his prejudices had blinded him to security threats within his own command. His assumption that she posed no significant threat to enemy operations had led him to dismiss security protocols that might have prevented intelligence gathering about her true capabilities. The realization that his personal biases had contributed to operational security failures forced him to confront the professional and personal costs of his attitudes toward female soldiers. The broader implications of the security breach extended beyond Fort Harrison to other installations where Maria had served during her military career. Intelligence analysts discovered that enemy forces had been tracking her assignments and building comprehensive profiles of her capabilities for years. Her efforts to maintain a low profile had been partially successful in preventing recognition by friendly forces, but they had been completely ineffective against hostile intelligence services that employed different criteria for identifying significant threats. Captain Reynolds from Special Operations had arrived at Fort Harrison 3 days before the attack as part of a classified operation to investigate suspected security breaches affecting multiple military installations. His team's presence during the training exercise had been designed to provide cover for surveillance activities aimed at identifying the sources of intelligence leaks that had compromised defensive capabilities across the region. The timing of the attack suggested that enemy forces had detected the investigation and accelerated their operational timeline to avoid capture. The debriefing sessions that followed the attack brought together personnel from multiple agencies and units to analyze what had occurred and develop strategies for preventing similar incidents. Maria's participation in these sessions required her to provide detailed accounts of her observations and actions during the engagement, descriptions that revealed tactical knowledge and situational awareness that couldn't be explained by her official background. The contradictions between her demonstrated capabilities and her personnel records became impossible to ignore or explain through conventional narratives. Intelligence analysts studying enemy documents captured during the attack discovered references to Operation Nightfall, a comprehensive plan to neutralize key American military personnel who posed significant threats to hostile operations worldwide. Maria's name appeared prominently on target lists that included special operations personnel, intelligence officers, and other individuals whose elimination would significantly degrade American military capabilities. Her inclusion on such lists indicated that enemy forces possessed detailed knowledge of her true background and considered her a priority target. The revelation that she had been specifically targeted by hostile forces forced military leadership to acknowledge that Maria's attempts to maintain operational security had failed completely. Her true identity and capabilities were known to enemy intelligence services regardless of her efforts to conceal them from friendly forces. The disconnect between what American military leadership knew about her and what enemy forces knew created vulnerabilities that threatened ongoing operations and personnel safety. Private First Class Thompson, whose attention to detail and regulation compliance had made him skeptical of Maria's unusual capabilities, found himself reviewing official documentation with new understanding of the discrepancies he had observed. Her personnel files contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested careful editing to conceal information that might reveal her true background. Training records showed gaps that could indicate classified assignments or specialized education that wasn't reflected in standard military documentation. Most significantly, her assignment to Fort Harrison appeared to have been orchestrated through channels that bypassed normal personnel management procedures. The psychological evaluation that followed any major combat engagement brought Maria into contact with Dr. Sarah Chun, a military psychologist whose experience with special operations personnel had given her familiarity with the unique stress responses and coping mechanisms developed by individuals with classified backgrounds. Chun's initial assessment of Maria revealed psychological profiles that suggested exposure to combat stress and operational pressures far beyond what her official record could account for. Her recommendations for follow-up evaluation would require Maria to undergo testing that might reveal training and experience she had worked to conceal. Corporal Williams's analysis of the tactical aspects of the engagement led him to conclusions about Maria's background that he was reluctant to voice without additional confirmation. Her understanding of enemy tactics, her ability to predict their movements, and her knowledge of counterinsurgency techniques suggested experience with operations that weren't reflected in any training records he could access. When he shared his observations with Sergeant Martinez, their discussion revealed that both had independently reached similar conclusions about her likely background, though neither was prepared to confront her directly about their suspicions. The communications intercepts captured during the attack included references to Maria that used operational coding names and tactical designators that didn't appear in any American military databases. Enemy forces had assigned her a classification that suggested they considered her a significant threat requiring special operational attention. The intercepts described her capabilities in terms that indicated detailed knowledge of her training and experience, information that could only have been obtained through comprehensive intelligence operations or insider sources. Major Collins, Davidson's second-in-command, was tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of all personnel assigned to units that had engaged enemy forces during the attack. His evaluation of Maria's performance required him to reconcile the exceptional capabilities she had demonstrated with the limited background reflected in her official records. The contradictions were so significant that he recommended immediate investigation by counterintelligence personnel to determine whether security protocols had been compromised or whether other explanations existed for the discrepancies. The after-action medical evaluation revealed that Maria had sustained injuries during the engagement that she had continued to function through without seeking immediate treatment. Her ability to maintain combat effectiveness despite wounds that would have incapacitated less experienced personnel suggested pain tolerance and stress management that typically required extensive conditioning. When medical personnel examined her injuries, they discovered healing patterns and scar tissue that indicated previous wounds, consistent with combat experience that wasn't reflected in her medical records. The enemy's tactical approach during the attack demonstrated familiarity with Fort Harrison's defensive capabilities that extended beyond what could be obtained through external reconnaissance. The coordination and timing suggested access to classified information about personnel assignments, equipment capabilities, and operational procedures that should have been available only to individuals with appropriate security clearances. The scope of their intelligence indicated security breaches had been occurring for months or years, with information being systematically collected and analyzed to support detailed operational planning. Intelligence analysts reviewing captured enemy equipment discovered sophisticated communication devices and tactical gear that indicated state-level support for the attacking forces. The weapons and technology they employed were current-generation military hardware that suggested access to advanced development programs and manufacturing capabilities. Most concerning, some of their equipment included modifications and enhancements that appeared to be specifically designed to counter American defensive systems and tactics. The identification of several enemy personnel through biometric analysis revealed connections to international terrorist organizations and hostile intelligence services that had been targeting American military installations for years. Their backgrounds indicated professional military training and operational experience that explained their tactical sophistication during the attack. The realization that Fort Harrison had been assaulted by professional soldiers rather than irregular combatants forced a reevaluation of defensive requirements and threat assessments. Captain Reynolds's investigation into the security breaches that had enabled the attack soon focused on personnel who had access to the types of classified information that enemy forces had demonstrated knowledge of during their assault. Maria's unusual combination of access and capability made her a person of interest in the investigation, despite her obvious contributions to the base's defense. The counterintelligence implications of her situation required careful analysis to distinguish between security threats and operational assets that might have been misidentified. The psychological pressure of maintaining operational security while undergoing intensive investigation began to affect Maria's ability to function effectively in her assigned role. The stress of concealing her true background while being scrutinized by multiple agencies created psychological burdens that threatened to compromise her mental health and operational effectiveness. Her conversations with Dr. Chen revealed signs of chronic stress and psychological fatigue that suggested long-term exposure to pressures that exceeded those typically associated with regular military service. Sergeant Martinez's growing understanding of Maria's true capabilities led him to begin protecting her from investigations and evaluations that might compromise her operational security. His experience with classified operations and personnel had taught him to recognize when official documentation didn't reflect the complete truth about military assignments and backgrounds. His decision to shield Maria from certain types of scrutiny indicated that he suspected her true identity was protected by classification levels that exceeded his clearance to access. The revelation that enemy forces had possessed detailed intelligence about Maria's capabilities and background forced military leadership to confront the possibility that their own security measures had been fundamentally compromised. The disconnect between what friendly forces knew about her and what hostile intelligence services had discovered suggested that American operational security procedures were inadequate to protect personnel with classified backgrounds from identification and targeting by sophisticated adversaries. Private Johnson's increasing respect for Maria's capabilities was tempered by his growing awareness that she had been concealing significant aspects of her background throughout their months of service together. His feelings of betrayal at learning that she had been operating below her actual capability level competed with gratitude for her contributions to their survival during the attack. The personal relationships that had developed within the squad were complicated by the revelation that one of their members had been maintaining fundamental deceptions about her identity and experience. The broader investigation into security breaches affecting multiple military installations soon revealed that Maria's situation was not unique. Intelligence analysts discovered evidence of enemy intelligence operations targeting American military personnel with classified backgrounds, operations that had been successful in identifying and tracking individuals regardless of their efforts to maintain operational security. The scope of these operations suggested that American Counterintelligence capabilities were insufficient to protect personnel from sophisticated adversaries with state-level resources. Colonel Davidson's forced recognition of Maria's exceptional capabilities created cognitive dissonance that challenged his fundamental beliefs about military service and gender roles. His need to reconcile her demonstrated competence with his existing prejudices led to increasingly desperate attempts to find alternative explanations for her performance. The psychological pressure of admitting that his assumptions had been completely wrong about someone he had consistently disparaged was creating professional and personal crises that threatened his ability to command effectively. The final revelation came when Captain Reynolds's investigation uncovered Maria's true identity and background, information that had been classified at levels that protected it from routine personnel inquiries. Her real name, training history, and operational experience painted a picture of military service that explained every capability she had demonstrated while raising new questions about why she had been assigned to a regular infantry unit under false documentation. The truth about who Maria Elena Rodriguez really was would transform everyone's understanding of what had been happening at Fort Harrison, but it would also create new dangers that threatened her life and the lives of everyone who had come to depend on her exceptional abilities. Captain Reynolds entered the briefing room carrying a classified folder that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows through the reinforced windows as he placed the documents on the conference table where Colonel Davidson, Sergeant Martinez, and the key personnel from the previous night's engagement had assembled. Maria sat at the far end of the table, her hands steady despite knowing that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reynolds began, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had taken months to uncover, "I need to inform you about the true identity of someone you've been serving alongside." He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph that made Davidson's face drain of color. The image showed a younger Maria in different uniform, standing with a group of elite soldiers whose faces had been redacted for security purposes. "Meet Lieutenant Maria Elena Rodriguez, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Classified Operations Division," Reynolds continued. "Combat veteran of 3 deployments, Distinguished Service Cross recipient, and one of only 12 female soldiers ever selected for the Pentagon's Advanced Tactical Assessment Program." The silence in the room was absolute as each person processed information that recontextualized everything they thought they knew. Davidson's hands trembled as he reached for the documents, his eyes scanning credentials that demolished every assumption he had made about the soldier he had spent months disparaging. Maria's actual service record read like a catalog of exceptional achievement, with commendations and classifications that placed her among the military's most elite personnel. Her assignment to Fort Harrison hadn't been routine personnel management. It had been a classified operation designed to investigate security breaches that had compromised multiple installations. Sergeant Martinez felt pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place as he reviewed Maria's true qualifications. Her tactical knowledge, technical expertise, and leadership capabilities suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Ranger training and classified operations experience. The careful way she had managed her performance to avoid standing out took on new meaning when understood as operational security rather than natural modesty. The enemy forces that attacked us last night specifically targeted Lieutenant Rodriguez because they identified her as the primary threat to their intelligence gathering operations, Reynolds explained. "She's been operating under deep cover for 8 months, investigating how classified information about our defensive capabilities was being leaked to hostile intelligence services." The scope of Maria's actual mission became clear as Reynolds outlined the counterintelligence operation that had brought her to Fort Harrison. Private Johnson struggled to reconcile the quiet soldier who had served alongside him with the decorated Special Operations veteran described in the classified documents. His memories of their months together took on new dimensions as he recognized moments when Maria had subtly guided their training and protected them from mistakes that could have had serious consequences. Her patience with his equipment problems and willingness to help with technical issues suddenly seemed less like friendly assistance and more like professional mentorship from someone vastly more experienced. Maria's response to having her cover blown was characteristically direct and professional. She stood and addressed the room with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide their capabilities. "Sir, my operational security has been compromised, but the mission objectives remain valid," she said to Reynolds. "The intelligence leaks that enabled last night's attack are still active, and there are additional threats that require immediate attention." Colonel Davidson's world had fundamentally shifted in the span of 10 minutes. The soldier he had consistently described as unfit for military service was revealed as more qualified than most of his officers. His public statements about her limitations and his recommendations for her transfer suddenly appeared not just wrong but professionally incompetent. The humiliation was compounded by the realization that his prejudices had blinded him to security threats that could have gotten people killed. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Davidson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express." The admission came with visible difficulty, each word challenging beliefs he had held for decades about military capability and leadership. "Your performance during the attack saved lives, and my failure to recognize your abilities compromised our defensive readiness." Reynolds continued his briefing with details about the intelligence operation that had necessitated Maria's deep cover assignment. Enemy forces had been systematically infiltrating American military installations through compromised personnel and sophisticated technical surveillance. Maria's investigation had identified multiple security vulnerabilities, but her cover had prevented her from acting on the information until the attack forced her hand. The technical analysis of enemy capabilities during the assault revealed the extent of their intelligence-gathering success. They had possessed detailed knowledge of Fort Harrison's defensive positions, personnel assignments, and communication procedures that could only have been obtained through long-term surveillance or insider sources. Maria's counterintelligence work had been focused on identifying the specific methods being used to compromise classified information. Corporal Williams found himself reviewing every interaction he had shared with Maria through the new lens of her true identity. Her subtle guidance during tactical exercises, her ability to predict enemy movements, and her knowledge of advanced procedures all made sense when understood as the actions of an experienced special operations soldier rather than an exceptionally gifted recruit. His respect for her capabilities was now matched by admiration for the discipline required to maintain such comprehensive deception. Dr. Chun's psychological evaluation of Maria took on new significance when viewed in the context of her actual background and mission requirements. The stress responses and coping mechanisms that had seemed unusual for a junior enlisted soldier were entirely appropriate for someone with extensive combat experience operating under deep cover for months. Her recommendations for continued evaluation would need to account for the unique pressures associated with classified operations rather than routine military service. The investigation into how enemy forces had discovered Maria's true identity revealed sophisticated intelligence operations that had been targeting American special operations personnel for years. Digital forensics showed evidence of cyber intrusions into personnel databases that had been occurring for months, with enemy hackers systematically gathering information about classified assignments and operational histories. Maria's operational security had been compromised not through any failure on her part, but through systemic vulnerabilities in military information systems. Major Collins's review of the security implications extended beyond Fort Harrison to other installations, where similar intelligence breaches might have occurred. The enemy's knowledge of Maria's background suggested that other undercover personnel might also be at risk. requiring immediate notification and protection measures across multiple commands. The scope of the security compromise was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Private Thompson's attention to regulatory details proved valuable as he identified discrepancies in administrative procedures that had enabled unauthorized access to classified information. His documentation of unusual patterns in personnel assignments and equipment requests provided crucial evidence for the ongoing investigation. The bureaucratic irregularities he had noticed but dismissed as clerical errors were actually indicators of systematic intelligence gathering by hostile forces. The medal ceremony took place 1 week after the attack, with representatives from multiple commands present to witness the formal recognition of exceptional performance under combat conditions. Maria stood at attention as Reynolds read the citation. For her Combat Action Badge, an award that acknowledged not just her technical qualifications, but her courage under fire and commitment to protecting her fellow soldiers. Colonel Davidson's presentation of the award carried personal significance that extended beyond the formal military ceremony. His public recognition of Maria's exceptional service represented a fundamental transformation of attitudes that had shaped his entire military career. The words he spoke acknowledged not just her individual achievements, but the broader principle that capability and courage were not limited by gender or physical appearance. Lieutenant Rodriguez exemplifies the finest traditions of military service, Davidson said, his voice carrying conviction that was evident to everyone present. Her dedication to duty, tactical expertise, and selfless commitment to protecting others reflect the highest standards of professional excellence. This command is honored to serve alongside such an exceptional soldier. Sergeant Martinez's pride in Maria's recognition was tempered by his understanding of the personal cost she had paid to maintain her deep cover assignment. The months of enduring disrespect and proving herself repeatedly while unable to reveal her true qualifications had required psychological strength that complemented her tactical skills. Her willingness to accept such treatment in service of a larger mission demonstrated the kind of selfless dedication that defined the military's best personnel. The squad's reaction to learning Maria's true identity created new dynamics that would take time to fully develop. The respect she had gradually earned through demonstrated competence was now enhanced by knowledge of her actual background and qualifications. But there was also recognition that their relationships had been built on a foundation that included necessary deceptions, requiring adjustment and rebuilding of trust on new terms. The broader implications of Maria's successful counterintelligence operation extended throughout the military community as security procedures were updated to address the vulnerabilities her investigation had identified. The intelligence she had gathered during her months at Fort Harrison provided crucial insights into enemy capabilities and methods that would enhance defensive measures at installations worldwide. Her sacrifice of personal comfort and recognition had yielded benefits that would protect countless military personnel. Enemy intelligence services' specific targeting of Maria confirmed the effectiveness of her previous operations and the threat she represented to their activities. The resources they had devoted to identifying and tracking her demonstrated the significant impact that individual operators could have when properly trained and positioned. Her survival of their assassination attempt would complicate their future operations against American Special Operations personnel. Captain Reynolds's final briefing on the operation included recommendations for Maria's future assignments that would utilize her proven capabilities, while providing appropriate recognition for her exceptional service. The success of her deep cover mission had established her as one of the military's most valuable counterintelligence assets, opening opportunities for advancement and specialized roles that matched her demonstrated abilities. The personal relationships Maria had developed during her months at Fort Harrison would continue despite the revelations about her true identity. The bonds formed through shared training and combat would survive the adjustments required by her changed status, though they would evolve in ways that reflected new understanding of her background and capabilities. Her teammates' respect for her had been earned through consistent performance rather than false premises, providing a solid foundation for continued friendship and professional cooperation. The investigation's conclusion brought recognition that Maria's operation had prevented far more serious security breaches that could have compromised military operations worldwide. The intelligence network she had identified and disrupted had been preparing for coordinated attacks against multiple installations that would have caused significant casualties and operational disruption. Her patient work and willingness to endure personal hardship had saved lives and protected national security interests. Colonel Davidson's transformation following the revelations about Maria's true identity extended beyond personal recognition to institutional changes that would benefit future personnel assignments and evaluation procedures. His experience with unconscious bias and its potential consequences led to new training programs and assessment methods designed to prevent similar errors in judgment. The lessons learned from his interactions with Maria would influence military leadership development for years to come. 3 months after the attack, Maria received notification of her promotion to captain and assignment to the Pentagon Special Operations Command, where her counterintelligence expertise would be applied to protecting classified programs from foreign intelligence threats. Her success at Fort Harrison had established her reputation among senior leadership as an exceptional officer whose capabilities warranted the most challenging and important assignments. The combat action badge she wore represented more than recognition for courage under fire. It symbolized the vindication of her commitment to service, despite facing prejudice and obstacles that would have discouraged less determined individuals. Her willingness to endure months of disrespect while maintaining professional excellence demonstrated the kind of character that defined the military's finest leaders. Fort Harrison's improved security posture, based on vulnerabilities Maria had identified during her investigation, became a model for defensive measures implemented at military installations worldwide. The counterintelligence techniques she had developed and the intelligence networks she had mapped provided ongoing protection against similar threats. Her contribution to military security extended far beyond her individual service record to encompass systemic improvements that would protect future generations of service members. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of special operations and counterintelligence, Maria's operation at Fort Harrison would be recognized as a turning point in understanding how individual dedication and professional excellence could overcome institutional prejudices while advancing national security objectives. Her story would inspire future generations of soldiers who faced similar challenges, demonstrating that capability and courage could prevail over bias and assumption when supported by unwavering commitment to duty and honor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.